As I sit down to write and record this video, it's been almost a year to the day since my last upload, which was coincidentally also a Game of the Year video. I may not be able to keep up with regular content on this channel, but if there's one thing I refuse to miss, it's Game of the Year time. Before we get into this, I'm not doing special awards this year, but I do have some quick shoutouts for some games that didn't quite make the cut. Triangle Strategy, a game with that gorgeous HD pixel art style that I love from Octopath Traveler slapped over a solid tactical RPG with a surprisingly involved political narrative. A decent enough time if a little long-winded and not especially adventurous with its gameplay systems. Vampire Survivors, the most video game-ass video game I played last year. Combining Castlevania-esque sprite work with a gameplay formula that's like a half step above Idle Game, I get why people are clamoring over this as a Game of the Year candidate, and if I'd maybe sunk more time into it, I'd be in that crowd too. But I didn't, so I'm not. WWE 2K22. Honestly, it's not that far removed from the previous entries in 2K's pro wrestling franchise, but it's substantially more functional and relatively snappy to control, so, you know, you gotta take the win where you can. Like, WWE 2K20 was a fucking trash fire, let's not forget. Metal Hellsinger. Doom, but make it a rhythm game. Amazing idea, sounds exactly like the kind of thing I'd get into. It's a shame it just didn't seem to click. I personally think the balance between the two gameplay aspects is a bit off, but it could just be that I needed to give this one more time. Maybe it'll come back next year in some sort of old Game of the Year capacity. The Pokemon Company. Yeah, no, not a game, but if we're being honest, the games that the Pokemon Company released this year don't have a chance in hell at Game of the Year. But I think it's worth calling out that both Scarlet and Violet and Pokemon Legends Arceus are doing interesting things with a franchise that's overdue for some fresh ideas. Scarlet and Violet's open world approach was surprisingly fun and engaging, and Legends' focus on study rather than battle makes for some really unique motivation in a Pokemon game. Now you just gotta bring a little more polish to the table and maybe smash these ideas together and we're talking. Anyway, that's it for shoutouts, let's do this. Let's count down the top 10 games of 2022. Number 10. Kirby and the Forgotten Land. It's kinda wild that it took 30 years for Nintendo's little pink puffball to finally take his first full 3D platforming steps, but hey, when it's this good, I guess you can't complain too much. And believe me, Kirby and the Forgotten Land is that good. Like its predecessors, the Forgotten Land is welcoming to players of all ages and skill levels with its unrelentingly adorable characters and animations, catchy upbeat tunes, including a sing-along theme to kick things off, and simple yet satisfying gameplay. But of course there's more under the hood if you're willing to put in the effort. The hood in this scenario being Kirby's mouth. Just stick your head right in there. As with so many Nintendo platformers, there are always extra unlockables and collectibles to really test you, and Kirby's shift to full 3D allows for some more deviously hidden secrets to be sure. But Kirby has a couple extra tricks up his sleeve. Or mouth, again, I guess. Permanent unlockable upgrades to copy abilities give the tried and true Kirby mechanics a little extra depth, while the Forgotten Land's marquee feature, Mouthful Mode, punctuates the familiar Nintendo offerings with just a dash of ludicrous spectacle. Honestly, every time Kirby deep-throats a car or a staircase or some other comically large object, I can't help but smile from ear to ear. And you can do it all with a friend playing as Bandana D. How cute! Speaking of cute, the game moves all of the Waddle Dees you save throughout your adventure back to a hub world that grows in size and function as it becomes more populated, giving you access to a boss rush arena and other bite-sized offerings including an adorable Kirby Cafe minigame. Between level secrets to collect, minigames to mess around with, abilities to upgrade, and even more, much more challenging levels to tackle once the credits roll, this game isn't messing around when it comes to giving you bang for your buck. Like the game's titular hero, Kirby and the Forgotten Land is absolutely stuffed with content and it's all dripping with charm. And saliva, presumably. Number 9. Marvel's Midnight Suns. Possibly the most surprising entry on this list, for me at least, Midnight Suns is a game that I had high hopes for when it was announced, but I would be lying if I said my expectations matched. I just never saw enough of the game, and the word salad of turn-based deck builder tactical RPG always seemed so bizarre for a game starring Marvel characters. And it is bizarre, but like in a really cool and unique way. So much so that I think the mechanical side of Midnight Suns is doing most of the heavy lifting here. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot to enjoy about the game. The cast of characters is a solid lineup of Marvel headliners like Iron Man, Wolverine, and Captain Marvel, but there's a few deep cuts on the roster too, like Magic, Nico Minoru, and Ghost Rider, but not the Ghost Rider that you probably think of when I say Ghost Rider. The story is pretty standard save the world comic book fare, but there's a lot of interpersonal drama too, and individual story arcs that are more interesting. And you get to experience those using a Fire Emblem style social system, which is a pleasant surprise. Outside of its core mechanics, Midnight Suns features a ton of design choices that you probably expect, peppered with little surprises here and there to keep things from being predictable. And then there's the gameplay, which is fairly simple and a little restrictive on the surface, but it allows for some insane synergy and strategy once you really get a feel for it. You're only given 3 card plays, 1 move, and 2 redraws per turn, but you soon learn that by customizing your character's decks, taking advantage of abilities and statuses that refund card plays, and combining smart card plays with effective environmental attacks using your movement, you can clear missions before the bad guys even know they're beaten. This is all very, very satisfying, but I think my favorite element of Midnight Suns is actually how each hero's available cards effectively characterizes them and their abilities. Wolverine's lifesteal combos, Blade's bleed and mark capabilities, Captain America's insane blocking. Despite being limited to the card game structure, these characters all still feel like they should, which is an absolute win for something as bizarre and cool as Marvel's Midnight Suns. Number 8. Pentiment. When you look at the studio that made games like Fallout New Vegas and The Outer Worlds, Pentiment can seem a little bit out of place. At a glance, this 2D historical fiction adventure game has little in common with Obsidian's usual open-world RPGs, but the developer's long history of providing meaningful player choice is the detail that this game really zeroes in on. Pentiment is a tale that focuses on a Bavarian village in the 1500s, where a web of murder and conspiracy is unfolding across 25 years, which you will have to try to untangle. I'm being intentionally vague here because the game's story is easily one of its strongest elements, but my point is that its 25-year timeframe is integral to making Pentiment a great showcase of Obsidian's approach to actions and consequences. You get to see the long-term outcomes of your decisions shortly after making them. This is like Mass Effect, but without having to wait 2 or 3 games to see how stuff turns out. Things you say and do in Act 1 will have ramifications in Act 2, and so on. Maybe someone marries because of a comment you make about your character's love life. Maybe someone leaves to see the wider world because you suggest it. You are certainly going to lose some characters along the way because this is a murder mystery and 16th century justice was very final. But it's not just that you get to see the effects of your choices after years of them rippling outward. Pentiment also makes the actual mysteries you're trying to solve nail-biting affairs, because with the way the game accounts for progression of time and your abundance of suspects, you'll never actually be able to research every lead to its logical conclusion. You've got to Phoenix Wright yield suspects fast and without the entire picture. It is stressful, and it is perfect. Speaking of perfect, Pentiment's presentation is sublime. The game's music feels historically authentic, and the mix of art inspired by various period-appropriate media says a lot about the characters that each style portrays, as do the fonts that they use to speak. Yes, we are really praising fonts here. Even the way that a character's dialogue might start as one font and change to another when they say something that alters your character's perception of them is a brilliant piece of non-standard storytelling. Pentiment is easily the most niche game to make it into my Game of the Year list for 2022, but if you come away from this video inspired to play any of these games, I really hope it's this one. It may not be my number 1, but it is probably the most special game on this list. Number 7. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. Longtime viewers of this channel will know that while I enjoy a good beat 'em up, I wouldn't call the genre a favourite. But sometimes a game manages to deliver the right amount of flash and flair on top of some truly satisfying combat, and I just can't ignore it. It happened in 2020 with Streets of Rage 4, and it's happened again this year with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, albeit a little differently. Where Streets of Rage 4 was brimming with effortless style and badassness, TMNT excels in the area of fanservice and nostalgia. The game draws heavily from the '87 Ninja Turtles animated series and the related arcade games, with its cast of characters and locations brought to life through detailed and gorgeously animated pixel art. And the title's upbeat, energetic pop-rock soundtrack sounds like it came straight out of one of those old arcade machines, only much cleaner thanks to the modern tech behind it. Honestly, with all the game's presentational aspects working together, it's hard not to love Shredder's Revenge. It's just so appealing to look at and listen to. If you're a TMNT fan, you probably just want to sit there and soak it all in for a bit. I know I did. But who has time for that when there are ninjas, mutants, and aliens to beat up? Thankfully, Shredder's Revenge isn't just a pretty face, backing up all that delightful sprite work, an absolute bop of a soundtrack with hard-hitting gameplay, and a surprisingly large and varied roster of playable characters that makes playing and replaying the story feel fun and worthwhile. As a Donatello fan, I love that he's still the king of range, but it's very satisfying bringing the pain as Raph or unleashing wild combos with Mikey. And while I don't have the crew for it, 6-player co-op is a tantalizing prospect. If you're not a fan of the old Ninja Turtles cartoon, then there's still plenty of fun to be had here, but Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is a treat for die-hard fans of the franchise, and an absolute must-play. Number 6. The Quarry. Supermassive Games' 2015 hit Until Dawn is a game I remember quite fondly thanks to its perfect mix of campy horror tropes and impressive, if a bit uncanny, performance capture. Since then, Supermassive have attempted to recapture that magic with the Dark Pictures anthology, with varying degrees of success. Sometimes you get a House of Ash, but then sometimes you get a little hope. It's a real mixed bag in there. This struggle to hit the same level of quality as Until Dawn made it incredibly surprising when Supermassive announced The Quarry in March, released it in June, and it turned out to be as good as, if not better than, the previous gold standard. Now, there isn't a ton to say about The Quarry that can't also be said about Until Dawn. Yes, the tech fueling the game's impressive performance capture is a little more polished than it was 7 years ago, as you might expect, and thanks to the current gen consoles, things run a lot smoother than they have in the past, but all in all, The Quarry is providing a very similar experience to Until Dawn. So, what is it exactly that pushes The Quarry just that little bit higher in my books? Well, beyond the grindhouse flavor that I personally vibe with a little more, I think The Quarry excels in its writing specifically. Supermassive games tend to have an issue with their teen characters trying and failing to sound like authentic teens, and I think the group of counselors in this game do a much better job than the cast of Until Dawn. On that same track, I think this group of hapless teens manages to be quite likable from the outset, unlike their predecessors. Another thing that I enjoy about The Quarry when compared to Until Dawn is that it's actually fairly difficult to pull off a perfect survival run on your first attempt, which I feel lends the game a bit more genuine tension. Finally, I just really love the monster and type of horror being played with this time around, and sometimes you just can't account for taste. With that said though, if you're looking for a game that you can tear through in about a day that has a killer story and is just dripping with campy horror, you can't go wrong with the literal horror camp that is The Quarry. Number 5. Elden Ring. Surprise surprise, From Software here, and they've brought a weighty action RPG with a vague story and bosses that are determined to stick their swords so far up your ass you'll be tasting steel for weeks. No, but seriously, From Software have proven they're masters of this song and dance before, and Elden Ring is a fun twist on their usual hard-as-nails RPG formula. Setting the game in the open world of the lands between rather than a series of open-ish dungeons and landscapes does shake things up a fair bit, giving you free reign over exploration and thus a broader range of early options for building your character. In that sense, Elden Ring feels a lot easier to experiment with than any of its spiritual predecessors. This structure also makes leveling up off the main story path much less of a grind, so while it can be the hardest Souls-like if you power through the main plot, it can also be the easiest if you're the type to complete everything in a given area before moving on. If nothing else, this structure makes Elden Ring more immediately accessible than Dark Souls or Bloodborne, since you don't really need to grind in order to become artificially powerful. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't drawbacks to this design shift. Elden Ring, for all its openness, does lack some of the tailored experience that Bloodborne or Dark Souls offer. The difficulty curve is all over the place, and asset reuse is an unfortunate necessity when so much of the game involves exploring similar caves and catacombs. But this is the price you pay to make a game that feels immediately more inviting for subsequent, more experimental playthroughs. And looking past the pros and cons of open world game design, the elements that From Software always nails are still here and they are still shining. Boss fights are still these intense struggles with immense beings, and although it's far easier to accidentally overlevel than it has been previously, the sense of satisfaction you get from overcoming these challenges, or simply smashing them beneath your boot, is still unmatched by most games. On top of that, there's a lot of great music and some stunning visuals, and the sense of adventure you get from that open world is undeniably engaging. I had countless moments where I would stop and stare at the vast landscape ahead of me and think to myself, I wonder what's gonna kick my ass across that next hill. And invariably it would be something horrifying. At the end of the day, if I'm being honest, Elden Ring isn't my favorite From Software game. In fact, I'm not sure it even ranks in my top 3, but it is a refreshing take on the formula that encourages trying new things, and I gotta respect that.
Pillagers, emboldened by the flame of ambition. Have it writ upon thy meager grave. Felled by King Morgoth, last of all kings.
Number 4. Cult of the Lamb. Confession time, I'm not actually that keen on roguelike dungeon crawlers. Like, the typical mechanics on offer are usually fine, but at a base level they're usually a bit too repetitive for me. It's why, although I can see the appeal and do find some enjoyment in them initially, games like Hades don't quite stick around in my headspace. But Cult of the Lamb might have found the secret to this very me issue, and that secret is to just add more genres to the mix until you have almost a whole other game on top of the dungeon crawler. Arguably, Cult of the Lamb is not the most polished roguelike dungeon crawler around, and on that particular front, it isn't doing a ton of new stuff. You dive into dungeons, making use of randomized magic, weapons, and buffs, and you die a bunch, but each attempt usually gets you access to more magic, weapons, and buffs, so you can get a little bit further every time. Where Cult of the Lamb changes the game, or rather adds another game to the game, is in the time between runs. Because as it turns out, you're running through these dungeons at the behest of the devil, or a close approximation, who wants revenge on the powerful beings that imprisoned them, and to enact that revenge, you need a cult. So the game has you rescuing potential cult members in dungeons before putting them to work at your home base, which will either help you grow your cult, or give you specific bonuses to take on your dungeon runs. In the early days, running the cult can be pretty time consuming as you build shelter and cook food for your followers, but before long, everything becomes satisfyingly self-sustaining. The mix of fun and frenetic dungeon crawler combat and Animal Crossing-esque settlement management is a quaint combination that really comes together thanks to the game's adorable art style juxtaposed with its twisted subject matter. And the game is a joy to simply vibe out to thanks to its very cool soundtrack. This thing is eerie and unsettling, but also just kinda groovy all at once, so shoutouts to Australian musician Riverboy for that one. As far as homegrown gems go, Cult of the Lamb is maybe the most complete package I've seen out of the Aussie games industry, and it deserves all the praise it's gotten since release and more. Number 3. God of War Ragnarok. 2018's God of War was an intense way to soft reboot a franchise that was predicated on hyperviolence and endless rage, taking Kratos on a hard narrative turn into an exploration of fatherhood and self-forgiveness that was surprisingly moving. God of War Ragnarok expands upon that thoughtful approach to narrative, seeing Kratos and Atreus moving forward with a slightly different, more familial dynamic, while other characters reckon with the events of the previous game. Ultimately, the game deals with the themes of letting go, often to better oneself, and it's a logical and engaging progression. A lot of what I dig about Ragnarok boils down to how the game's story and characters have evolved since the last game, but that's not to say that it doesn't introduce anything new on the gameplay side of things. Between a slightly tweaked upgrade system which encourages you to use techniques by allowing you to upgrade the stuff you use most, and a handful of new special abilities and weapons, combat in God of War Ragnarok is as hard-hitting and visceral as ever. In line with the theme of letting go, the game even lets you split from adventuring with Papa Kratos to let you directly control Atreus, which serves as a nice change of pace, even if these sections aren't as immediately enjoyable as the Kratos combat overall. Being a massive budget first-party sequel, God of War Ragnarok doesn't do a ton of new stuff, but the last game was of such a quality that it doesn't really need to. Like I said earlier, the narrative expansion is what earns the game a place on this list, and God of War Ragnarok delivers some truly intense emotional highs and lows across its hefty runtime. It manages that with the help of some of the most detailed visuals and powerful musical pieces in the industry. Every moment, whether colossal or minute in scope, feels important and impactful because the game treats it all with the appropriate weight. It also doesn't hurt that this game feels a little more generous in terms of its side content. Once you're done reeling from the emotional gut punch that is the narrative, it feels like there's plenty to do once the credits roll. And with a game this good, you won't hear me complaining about more God of War Ragnarok. Number 2. Horizon Forbidden West. Back in 2017, Horizon Zero Dawn drew me in with its promise of robot dinosaur hunting, but it kept me hooked thanks to the unfolding mysteries and world building behind its narrative, as well as the aforementioned robo-dino hunts. 5 years later, I find myself being drawn back into that setting with Horizon Forbidden West, where, somehow, Guerrilla Games have even more wild mysteries and twists to unravel than it did in the first outing with Aloy. Now, if you didn't play that game, you should probably fix that, but don't worry too much because I don't intend on dropping any major spoilers for either game here. Just know that the revelations behind why the world of Horizon is in its current state and why Aloy turns out to be special are some galaxy brain ideas, and Forbidden West does a respectable job in keeping that mind-blowing level of plot going. But let's be honest here, the real question to ask is, does the robot dinosaur hunting still hold up? And to that I say, of course it does. Horizon Forbidden West takes the mix of stealth and action that its predecessor introduced and expands on it in a bunch of cool new ways. New traps allow you more options for engaging new and returning beasts, Aloy's moveset has grown to include a more robust melee system and high-power special moves, and traversal has been given an overhaul, with Forbidden West featuring more climbable surfaces, the ability to swim underwater, and a glider to help you clear long-distance drops. And yes, the game features plenty of new and spectacular beasts to take down. Zero Dawn's T-Rex-like Thunderjaws make a return, but alongside these unstoppable tyrants are literal jet wolves and the Tremor-Tusk Mastodon, and all of these machine enemies are impressive to behold thanks to the game's stellar, weighty animation. On that note, the game's animation across the board feels much more natural this time around, specifically with regards to in-engine dialogue scenes where characters simply talk to one another. Everything feels a lot less stiff and robotic, which is good because there is a lot of dialogue to experience. I feel like this game's release window did it dirty this year, what with it releasing very early and alongside the highly anticipated Elden Ring, but for my money, Horizon Forbidden West is easily my favorite big budget game to drop in 2022.
But whatever comes. I will be ready.
Number 1. Sifu. Sifu is badass, it is impactful, it is satisfying, it is rewarding, and it is exhausting. No other game this year has had me throwing myself at the same brutal challenges again and again and again simply to prove to myself that I could do it better. And I hated it, but I loved it. At its most basic level, Sifu is a fairly standard beat 'em up with a handful of features that keep it from being the stock standard button masher that the genre brings to mind. You can chain together basic attacks, unlock skills and combos, and even dodge, parry, or block incoming attacks, which aren't common mechanics for all beat-em-ups, but it's how Sifu deals with death that really sets it apart. You see, every time you die in Sifu, your character ages. The first time you die, you age a single year. The next time, you age 2, then 3, and so on. In short, your run through the game has a strict timer attached to it, ending at around the 75-year mark. On paper this sounds pretty generous, but Sifu is not an easy game, especially when you're just getting started, so the years will start piling on faster than you can say, "Get off my lawn!" But it isn't just the fact that you have an age deadline to beat the game by that makes it compelling, as your character's age impacts other facets of the game. When you start out in your 20s, you'll have the most health at your disposal, but your strikes won't be all that strong. As you start to age, that balance shifts, and you'll turn into something of a glass cannon. Also, as your character grows older and wiser, you get access to more techniques to learn, and while these do reset upon your final death, you can permanently unlock them in a sort of roguelike fashion. Seriously, the aging system in Sifu is so cool, and it makes trying to beat a run while you're still in your 20s a weird and unique proposition. Even if you stripped all of that away though, Sifu's hard-hitting, supremely satisfying action would have sold me on it. The game drips with reverence for Hong Kong action cinema, with animations and audio work that make the combat feel truly impactful, and its environments would feel right at home in any iconic kung fu movie. The icing on the cake is that there are even secret paths and locations that provide a touch of replay value to this game that I was already going to replay simply to do better. And that says something, because I'm not the kind of guy who plays games specifically to improve on my own efforts. I'm not a score attack guy, or Rollerdrome and Neon White probably would have made this list. When it comes to beating up scores of dudes, making you feel awesome and pushing you to kick ass better, Sifu is truly the master. Well folks, we did it. We survived another year. And hey, there were some cool ass games to play, which is frankly more than we can really hope for at this point. The wild part is, since I'm recording this in late January, 2023 already looks like it's shaping up to be a banger of a year for games. Hell, we've already got a new Fire Emblem, a half-decent refurbishment of Dead Space, and a weird rhythm action game coming out of Tango Gameworks called Hi-Fi Rush, and if nothing else, it looks very cool. But while we look ahead to the games of the future, I still want to hear about your favorite games of 2022. Did you get into Vampire Survivors? Are you, like me, spending far too much time on Destiny 2? Did you hit your head and somehow come up with Saints Row as your game of the year? Let me know in the comments below and I'll be around, maybe? Who can really say for sure? But whether I'm back again soon or in another year, you have my utmost gratitude for sitting here and listening to me for far too long, and I hope you have a fantastic 2023. Take care of yourselves and one another.